Our first reading is from Exodus. The Israelites had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites." So Moses came, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. The people all answered as one, "Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. Grace and peace to you all from the God of life, of love, and of liberation. Amen. The Exodus story is a familiar one, whether it conjures images of Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, or echoes the captivating music of the Prince of Egypt. This story has been so often retold on stage and screen, in the occasional camp song, in churches and synagogues, that the narrative is now a familiar and well-worn part of the fabric of our popular culture. It's a captivating story about the movement of a people from bondage to freedom, from survival to thriving. It seems to capture something universal about struggle and hope and our desire for freedom. And perhaps that's why so many people, even from different backgrounds and creeds, gravitate to it. It's a very human story. The Israelites have been in bondage in Egypt for centuries, and they cry out to God to come and rescue them. God hears these cries and sends Moses to deliver the people out of slavery. After countless plagues and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, he finally agrees to let the people go. Only once the multitude is on their way across Egypt does Pharaoh then change his mind and give chase to the Israelites, now with the Egyptian army in tow. God works a miracle through Moses at the Red Sea and opens the waters to let the Israelites pass through on dry ground. And as the Egyptian chariots enter the sea, the waters come crashing down on them, thus ensuring not only the safety, but actually the freedom of the Israelites. But of course, the adventure does not end there. There's a great desert on this side of the Red Sea, and there's many miles to go before the Israelites reach the land that was promised to them. And along the way, they start to get antsy. They become master complainers, asking why Moses brought them out into the desert to die, and insisting that life was better in Egypt, where, yeah, they might have been enslaved, but at least they had food to eat and water to drink. And in response, God provides them food from heaven and water from the rock at Meribah. God intercedes and assures their victory in the battle with the Amalekites. And finally, after all of that, the people reach the foot of Sinai and finally rest. And this is where the story gets good. This is where God is about to do a new thing. Because it isn't enough for God to take the people out of Egypt. God must now take Egypt out of the people. In the long years of slavery, the minds of the people were distorted. For so long, they were prized only for their labor, taught that their only value lay in their utility. I wonder if they began to believe it themselves. For so long, their humanity was diminished and objectified. I wonder if they began to see themselves as inferior, unworthy of full, rich, dynamic lives. For so long, the goal was merely to survive another day. I wonder if they forgot that they were meant to thrive. Yet here they are, with Egypt behind them, and God is establishing a new paradigm, recalibrating their hearts and minds, gently and lovingly reminding them that they were made for so much more than this. God tells them, "You are my treasured people, and if you obey these laws, keep our covenant, you shall be a holy nation." Put another way, God says, I love you, and I have brought you safely to me. I have liberated you from all that held you captive, and now I invite you to live in beloved community with me as free people. So God sets before them the law, instruction on how to treat one another with care and respect, how to live as holy and upright people, teachings that ensure the flourishing, abundant life for all people. God sets them free, but the choice is still before them whether to live as free people. And this is part of what makes the story universal. That choice is part of what it means to be human. It's the struggle that's present throughout human history. The choice lies before each of us: bondage or freedom, fighting to survive or thriving. Will we stay entrenched in ideologies and patterns that distort our humanity and the humanity of our neighbor, but are at least familiar? Or do we risk leaning into the abundant life, the liberation that God has set before us? And this idea challenges us because God's liberation is different than our Western secular ideas of freedom. It's not freedom in the sense that I'm free to do whatever I want, but rather it's the idea that demands something from us, that requires our action. As Franciscan theologian Father Richard Rohr writes, secular freedom only creates individualists and a private freedom, but not a society. It never gets around to the communal good, which is a central principle of the gospel, which instead demands from you and for others, while ironically giving you all that you really need. Then you become who you most deeply and truly are, a member of a family, a neighborhood, a society, and a planet. Liberation in its truest sense is belonging. It means being free to live in the fullest expression of all your unique gifts and quirks, your personality, all the particularity that God created in you and loves so deeply. It also means living in a community full of people who share the same freedom and seeing all the beauty and uniqueness and loveliness of each other. It means lifting up and celebrating and honoring who we truly are, who God truly created us to be. And that's not an individualistic action. It's not something that happens privately between us and God. That mutual acceptance happens only with and among a society that mirrors the radical love and hospitality of God to one another, that embodies the flourishing, abundant life that God has promised us. That is what it looks like to be a holy nation. But as of yet, the vision is incomplete. We have not yet arrived at that holy nation, that beloved community of God. We are, all of us, still captive to old ways of being in the world. Like the Israelites, our view of ourselves and each other is distorted, but familiar. And like the Israelites, our hearts and minds are in need of recalibration. Our history of racialized violence in this country bears out this need to disentangle ourselves from harmful patterns, to dismantle systems that, while familiar, keep us bound and prevent us from the fullness of life that is our birthright as children of God. White supremacy, by definition, denies and diminishes the humanity of those with darker skin. It has been the root of injustice upon injustice, including the denial of education, homeownership, wealth, employment, safety, self-governance, self-determination, and freedom to those who are not white. Simultaneously, the same ideology causes a psychological disturbance in the minds of white people, a kind of narcissistic psychosis that prevents them from seeing the beauty of diversity and enables the kind of cruelty that dehumanizes those who perpetrate it. While this destructive ideology affects us quite differently in our particularity, nevertheless, our bondage to it is mutual, and therefore our liberation must be also. Not one of us will be truly free until all of us are. To paraphrase Lila Watson, our liberation is bound up together, and so we must work together to free ourselves. So, if we wish to become the holy nation that God has called us to be, we have work to do. We must be agents of God's liberation in this world, at work creating the societal framework that allows all the people the freedom to live fully in all the beauty, the power, and creativity and diversity for which they were created. The church can and should reclaim its place as a voice that calls for justice, works for social improvement, and seeks moral progress. And I think that we're getting there. The work is beginning. We have begun acknowledging the more difficult parts of our history, and we've begun naming our complicity in it. We mourn the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and we lament the systems that led to their unjustified murders. What might our next steps be? We can continue to educate ourselves. We can continue to question our own behaviors, our own implicit biases. We can commit ourselves to learning and improving. We can continue to protest. We can push for reform in our law enforcement and criminal justice systems. We can call our sheriffs and representatives and senators. We can elect into office people who care enough to write into law and who will work into being a more just and equitable society where we are accountable for the well-being of our neighbor. We can do all of this and more, and we must do it because Black lives hang in the balance, because our collective humanity, our hope for God's beloved community, hangs in the balance. This contract, this covenant that God renews at Sinai, which stems from God's great love for God's people and God's desire for our freedom, in which God promises, "I will be your God and you will be my people." This covenant establishes the framework for the thriving of all God's people. But it is incomplete without our participation as agents of life and liberation in the world. It is that covenant which both binds us to God and inextricably to one another, tying the liberation of our neighbor up with our own. It is this covenant that calls us to our work in the world, disentangling ourselves from structures that diminish our humanity and dismantling systems that keep us from the fullness of life that is ours by the grace of God. And it is actually through that work, that demand for justice, that unbinding ourselves from ideologies and behaviors that captivate us, that we become free, that we become the holy nation that God calls us to be. And I want to be clear, the road ahead of us is long. We won't undo problems that have been 400 years in the making in the matter of weeks or months. The labor will be ongoing, and it will likely outlast us. But that won't deter us. As it is written in the Talmud, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justice now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. We have work to do, and that work is good, and it is righteous, and it is what God calls us to. And so, my friends, onward. Amen.